In 1767, one surgeon deliberately infected a human subject with discharge from an active venereal disease patient, documenting every stage of infection in excruciating clinical detail. The penile sores, the spreading rashes, the systemic progression, all to prove a theory that would turn out to be completely wrong. This is John Hunter, and many historians believe that subject was himself. Welcome back to the lab, my curious test subjects. I'm your mad scientist, and today we're examining one of the most audacious experiments in medical history. A brilliant British surgeon who may have given himself both syphilis and gonorrhea in the name of science. Hunter was one of the most respected anatomists of his era, a pioneer in surgical techniques, and a man with an apparently unshakable belief in the power of direct observation. So when the medical establishment couldn't agree on whether gonorrhea and syphilis were the same disease or two different illnesses, Hunter decided to settle the question once and for all, with an experiment on a human subject who quite possibly was him. Let's talk about what happened when dedication to science meets spectacularly questionable judgment. So how exactly do you prove that two different venereal diseases are actually the same illness? Well, if you're John Hunter in 1767, the answer is obvious. You take discharge from a patient with gonorrhea, and you deliberately inoculate someone with it. Then you watch what happens, document everything, and draw your conclusions in 18th century medical ethics terms. That means you could do pretty much whatever you wanted as long as you wrote it down. Hunter was convinced that gonorrhea and syphilis were simply different manifestations of the same underlying disease. Different symptoms, same cause. It was a reasonable hypothesis for the time. Both were sexually transmitted, both produced uncomfortable and socially stigmatizing symptoms, and both were poorly understood. The medical literature was a mess of conflicting theories. Some doctors insisted they were distinct diseases. Others argued they were related. Hunter, ever the empiricist, wanted data, primary source data, the kind you can only get from direct observation of a controlled experiment. Think of it like a clinical trial, except there was no trial, no oversight, and quite possibly no second person involved. Hunter's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Inoculate a subject with gonorrheal discharge. Wait. Observe. If the subject developed only gonorrhea, the diseases were different. If the subject developed syphilis too, they were the same. Science. Hunter's clinical notes from the experiment refer only to the subject. Never a name, never identifying details, just the subject, which is where things get interesting. Because for an experiment this detailed, this intimate, this invasive, Hunter sure was cagey about who exactly he was experimenting on. Spoiler: they were not the same disease. But Hunter wouldn't figure that out for quite some time. Now, you might be wondering, who was this mystery subject willing to be deliberately infected with venereal disease? Great question. Hunter never said. But the evidence, circumstantial as it is, points in a very specific direction. In 1767, Hunter took a lancet, collected discharge from a patient with active gonorrhea, and inoculated the subject's penis. In 18th century medical ethics terms, that means you could do pretty much whatever you wanted as long as you wrote it down. Then came the waiting and the documentation. Hunter recorded the appearance of penile sores in extraordinary clinical detail. The location, the texture, the progression. Then came the rashes, spreading lesions consistent with secondary syphilis. The subject had developed both diseases, or so it seemed. Hunter treated the subject with mercury, which was the standard cure for syphilis at the time. Mercury treatment, which in modern terms is like curing a headache by drinking poison, until the headache seems less important. You took mercury until you salivated uncontrollably, your gums bled, and your teeth fell out. But hey, the syphilis symptoms eventually faded. So, success. The subject was declared cured. And then, something interesting happened. John Hunter, who had been engaged to a woman named Anne Home for years, suddenly got married, right after the experiment concluded. Completely normal timing for a wedding, obviously. Nothing suspicious about waiting years to marry your fiancé and then suddenly rushing to the altar the moment your mystery patient is declared disease-free. Hunter's colleagues noticed. Historians noticed. The timing was just a little too convenient. Was Hunter the subject of his own experiment? He never confirmed it, but he also never denied it, and the circumstantial evidence is pretty compelling. So did Hunter's experiment advance medical science? Well, about that, Hunter concluded that gonorrhea and syphilis were the same disease. One illness, two presentations. He published his findings. Other doctors cited his work. And for decades, the medical establishment accepted Hunter's conclusion as fact. There was just one tiny problem. Hunter was completely wrong. Gonorrhea and syphilis are caused by two entirely different bacteria. They're distinct diseases, always have been. The original patient, Hunter, took the discharge from had both infections simultaneously. Hunter had no way of knowing this. Germ theory didn't exist yet, but his experiment contaminated decades of medical understanding with a fundamental error. In 18th century medical ethics terms, that means you could do pretty much whatever you wanted as long as you wrote it down, even if what you wrote down was incorrect. But here's where the story gets darker. From the age of 45, John Hunter began suffering mysterious symptoms: severe chest pain, agonizing back pain, loss of pulses in his arms. The episodes came in waves, often triggered by stress or anger. And Hunter had a temper. An aortic aneurysm is basically a balloon in your main artery that can pop at any moment, like a ticking time bomb. Except the timer is your own blood pressure. In 1793, Hunter attended a board meeting at St. George's Hospital. He was arguing passionately, furiously, for the admission of two students he believed were being unfairly rejected. Mid-argument, he turned pale, walked into an adjoining room, and dropped dead. His autopsy revealed the cause. Not heart disease as many assumed, a syphilitic aortic aneurysm, the signature complication of untreated syphilis. Turns out, rage and syphilitic aneurysms are a bad combination. Hunter had spent decades living with the disease he may have deliberately given himself, and it killed him. And all it took was deliberately infecting yourself with venereal disease, being completely wrong about your conclusion, suffering for decades with a syphilitic aneurysm, and dying in a rage during a board meeting. The scientific method, my curious test subjects at its finest. John Hunter's experiment is a perfect case study in what happens when brilliant minds operate without ethical constraints, peer review, or the benefit of germ theory. He may have infected himself with two venereal diseases to answer a scientific question. He definitely got the answer wrong. He possibly suffered the consequences for the rest of his life, and he absolutely died from complications that suggest syphilis was ravaging his cardiovascular system for decades, all to prove a theory that wasn't true. Was Hunter a pioneer willing to sacrifice his own health for knowledge, or just a surgeon with more confidence than caution? History hasn't definitively answered that question, but the syphilitic aneurysm that killed him certainly suggests an answer. If you enjoyed this descent into 18th century medical hubris, hit that like button and subscribe for more experiments that should never have happened. I'll be here in the lab.